we go.
Well, welcome everyone, and friends, good to see you all once again. It's bright smiling faces here on a lovely afternoon in October. This is our third session, our Living into Inclusivity, our conversations examining issues of race and otherness in our society. And I'm Rufus Woods. I'm a former retired publisher of the Wenatchee World, and currently just a columnist and a community volunteer. And we are again, this is our third conversation together, and we are exploring what it means to be from the dominant culture in this country, and trying to understand better the dynamics of race and otherness, and our belief and the all we've read and talked about. The change begins from within, not looking for someone else to do that. And so I think we've all had a very rich experience in this. I know I have. I've learned a lot about you folks, and it's been a wonderful journey. We've had some great conversations. The structure of this is for rotating facilitators, and somehow I ended up with the short straw this time, and so I'll be guiding the conversation, although it doesn't really usually take a lot of guiding. We have a set of questions, 3 or 4 questions to ponder and reflect, and we will be, the individual who starts will find the next person to speak. So that seems to be working well so far. And for the first, this will be our third session. And there'll be our first session. We started with the Racial Healing Handbook, a book by Anneliese Singh, and we're going to kind of tackle the first 2 chapters today, and think about a couple of the questions that kind of emerged from that. So with that said, maybe we should go through a quick round of introductions so that everyone knows kind of who we are. And so Sheila, would you like to start?
Sure, Sheila Marie, and I'm a pastor at First United Methodist Church in Wenatchee. Francis?
Yeah, hi, thanks. I'm Frances Twiggs, and I am the rector of St. Luke's Episcopal Church here in Wenatchee. I'll invite James.
I'm James Allgard, and I'm pastor at Grace Lutheran here in Wenatchee. Laura?
I'm Laura Shannon. I'm the pastor at Cascade Unitarian Universalist Fellowship in East Wenatchee. Dave?
Hi, I'm Dave Haven. I'm the pastor at Celebration Lutheran in East Wenatchee. John?
And I'm John Coleman Campbell, the other pastor at Wenatchee First United Methodist Church. And Karen?
I'm Karen Rutherford, and I'm an interested community member.
Great, and hopefully joining us shortly, Tom Neese. So we will introduce him when he gets here. And so we've agreed to look at the first couple of chapters of the Racial Healing Handbook, and some of that was terrain that really we had gone over quite a bit yet last time, but it moves us a bit further. And so the first question that we pondered, and Sheila, I'm gonna go back to you as to start the conversation. Lucky you. When I look at my community and my country, what do I observe that leads me to conclude that racism and racialization are part of the fabric of our society?
I will offer that when I first read this question, I oddly drew a blank in the sense that to me, there's just so much in front of us, the ongoing press and debates and numbers of people weighing in of all races is one example. The violence that we've seen, particularly since June, that's elevated because now it comes and shows up more and more and more in press and media. I thought of COVID in particular, and the press and the information that keeps coming out that tell us that different ethnicities react differently to the virus, and the compassion I feel around that, because Native American or First Nations people, persons of color, seem to be more highly impacted, and we're right in the middle of that right now. And I would say just an overall lack of or absence of compassion or stopping long enough to take a look at what's really happening instead of lacing it with specific points of view. And that's really what we're trying to address here. So that makes some sense, and that's what I have. Dave?
Yeah, thank you. That well, as you mentioned, there's a lot of examples of racism, and I got to thinking about the lack of knowledge about our history as a nation. And I've been currently reading a couple books that address that. Ibram Kendi, Stamped from the Beginning, is one of those examples where he goes back to the 400 years ago, and it's pretty appalling to see the history of racism, especially the introduction of slavery and so forth. And I still think there's such a denial of white supremacy and white body supremacy that was it's in the fabric of our society. And we even have leaders in our nation now that still deny that that's a reality. I think the putting down of movements like Black Lives Matter is something that's concerning, where we don't seem to be going into the reason why we're asking that question, why Black Lives Matter, but jumping to the conclusion that this is just a rogue movement and group that don't deserve our ear. So those are a couple of examples. So, John.
Yeah, I also kind of drew a blank initially on this as well. And want to be careful, I guess, not to attribute racism that is maybe more classism, or that where things affect the poorer population, which may be disproportionately ethnic minorities. So is it something about class, or is it race, or both? But I guess one thing in this election season, it seems that there are parts of this country where it's harder to vote if you're not white, that you have to stand in long lines. It is easier in the last couple of presidential election cycles. It's easier, it seems, for people to believe that that person isn't American who's running for that office because they're not white. Whether it was Barack Obama, previously, or Ted Cruz, or Kamala Harris or something, that they're not quite American the way we talk about them, and that may have to do with their names as well. That that's not an American name kind of thing. They must not be Americans. And I have heard that it is difficult for folks to maybe get a job application in or considered if their name doesn't sound like it's a white name. And how much truth there is to that, I don't know, but I would guess there's some. And so anyway, James. Unmute yourself first.
What I just said was totally profound. No,
And you can't remember what it was now, too, I'm sure.
Right, can't remember. No, yeah, there's this common theme of just kind of scratching my head too. And and I wish that I could be, maybe this is a goal for me actually, is to be a bit more attuned to what is going on around me in terms of racial preference, racism, and whatnot. But I've been in groups recently, like through Zoom, for example, a youth retreat that we did over Zoom, and a couple of participants have a Hispanic parent, a Latino parent, and they talked about the experience of going to a local store and being told that they have to leave their backpacks outside. But then they compare to friends who are not Latino or Hispanic, who it's okay for them to bring their backpacks into the stores. And so just even those simple comparisons, they understand it on one level, and I'm hearing that and I'm saying, oh my gosh, really? And then I think that perhaps I too, if I were to gauge my level of trust with people around me, if they're all just strangers, I know that I'm going to probably trust somebody who looks more like me, as a kind of an intuitive thing. And so that's something that I know I want to grow out of, if I can say it that way. Karen, have you had a chance to go?
There we go. Okay. Well, James, I want to say first off that I'm missing your clubhouse. Although this is a very nice room. I have had a couple of things where I work with here in town over the past 30 years that are near and dear to my heart, and that I have witnessed the inequality of racism. And one of them is in our schools. Although I will say that it is an issue that definitely our school systems are working on, and it's a very difficult one. Schools have always been, from the beginning of our country, where a lot of discrimination has taken place, from all the way down to separate but equal and different schools. So we still see a lot of that today. It's still there. You look at the largely Latino schools versus the white schools in the neighborhoods. And I worked for the school district for many years as a science coordinator. And there would be many times when I would pull up to a Latino school, and I know those teachers they are amazing there. But even the school itself physically looked older, even though it was the exact same age, because we built all of our schools exactly the same there for a period of time. It wasn't as well kept. The yards weren't as well kept. The lights weren't even on in some of the schools. I mean, the hallways were darker. And it was an interesting thing for me to start to even just talk about that, why that was, and how people didn't even notice it really. That kind of difference of resources. We really are working on programs. We're working on trying to get those resources off. But you look at the fact that a white school here in town will have a very wealthy PTA. Their kids will be exposed to a lot of different extracurricular activities, whereas a poorer school does not have that. And on that flip side, I'm also going to say that in terms of that, I have also witnessed from the other side, when a school does receive resources and perhaps a white family, a middle-class family states, well, why can't my child have that? You know, why is that Latino school getting everything? So there's this kind of catch-22, and I actually feel for that, because there was a period of time where a lot of our remedial education only went to our Latino schools. And so kids that needed remedial education but happened to be white and happened to go to a higher end school didn't have that. So there's this gray zone of where I really respected the Racial Healing Handbook in terms of where we're all at and the dance that we do. But I really see it in the schools. That's my big one.
Karen, can I ask you a question before
bet.
we move on? One of the things that we've heard about in this election season is about the idea of school choice vouchers. And I don't have very much personal experience with just even thinking through that as a possibility, but I have a sense that if that were some kind of a stronger program, that there would be this pulling away and leaving behind poorer communities. I just kind of see that as a logical conclusion to that, quote, opportunity. But I don't know if maybe you've thought about that yourself.
Well, actually, personally, I'm actually quite involved in that right now. I sit on the board, the founding board of the beginning of a charter school. And when we think of charter schools, we think of choice and we think of that pulling away. Our school is actually incredibly dedicated to the Latino community. It's going to be, we've received permission and we have the lease signed. We're located in the old St. Joe's Church and we're starting remodeling here soon. And it's a school that is going to be geared toward the South Wenatchee community. Now, it is ironic that it is a group of white people starting a school for a South Wenatchee neighborhood. But our board grows with more and more of the community, Latino community coming on board. There is a definite need for that type of a community. Our school will be open to all. And we already have 53 kids signed up and we only have space for originally about 100 and at maximum about 120. So, and it doesn't open until next fall. And of those 53, 60 kids that are signed up, they are quite a wonderful mix. They come from all over the valley. And probably about 30 to 40% are coming from that South Wenatchee neighborhood. And we've had a marvelous group of Parque Padrinos. I call them the Teresas, the mother and daughter team, also with some amazing Latino community members that have really reached out to their community to get kids involved and interested. And fingers crossed, that's where school choice might work. Charter school, we're going against all the grain of what a charter school might be. It's been an interesting road. It's been hard though. I won't dismiss that. Washington State Charters once asked me, one of the members there asked me what my biggest worry was. And I said, what keeps me awake at night is what business do I, at that time 63-year-old old white woman, what do I think I know about starting a school for a community that's not in my primary community? And that is a good question. But choice schools, when you take them, when they have that propensity to lead to further segregation. So we have to keep our eyes on it. We have to keep a watch for it. It's a tough one. I worry. So I'm going to pass it on. I'm going to pass it on to Rufus.
Well, thanks, Karen. So when I think about this question, I think about a number of different things. One, sort of, is racism just something a few people do? It's a personal thing, or a structural, something we're socialized to. And I think we have a struggle in this country stepping into the notion that that we're socialized to this, that the patterns have been going on for so long and we've gone from a very formal, very legal structure to a much less obvious, but just as powerful, but less legal structure. and so I think about how socialization happens and the impact, and I see signs of so and pretty much anywhere you look or anywhere I look at educational attainment, economic status. I look at the incarceration rates. Look at sort of just the long and ugly history of exclusion and oppression, and look at that and say, is it the fact that that these groups are inferior, or have we been socialized? And to me, it's very obvious that socialization, we're inclined this way, and all the social signals we get to, or we've had, have sort of pointed us in the direction of excluding others. And it's not just the United States; it's all over the world. But it's a fact here, even though it's politically it's controversial to a number of folks that I think would prefer not to have to think about this. But I think thinking about this, in fact, there are comments made at times that even bringing it up adds to more racism, and I don't believe that. I think we've failed to fully acknowledge, what's happened. In Canada, it was the residential schools. It was the Indian schools here in this country, and the profound impact and lasting impact, and the as one example of how deep and how long term these effects happen. Racism, we aren't in a post-racial period, I don't think, by any stretch of the imagination. We haven't even started to really to acknowledge and make amends for, atone for, what's happened. Not feeling sorry or it's about being sorry, but it's about acknowledging, I think, the structural systems of redlining neighborhoods and of segregating and keeping people apart, and keeping the economic power structure in place. And to me, those are things we need to address, and that it's just absolutely vital that we lean into this conversation, and begin to it's more than just I'm nice to Latinos, or I'm nice to people of color, or et cetera. It's what am I doing for justice? And I think that's the conversation that we're all about. So Frances, I think I'll pass it to you.
Thank you. So as everybody's been talking, I've mulling things over in my mind, and I, come back to thinking about, the institutionalized segregations and racisms that you were talking about, Rufus, and others. And also realizing that, that even when we create ways to have a structure that's not segregated, we're so socialized into it that we create our own voluntary segregation amongst ourselves. I can remember thinking, and this is a long time ago, I don't know that anything's changed all that much, but in the Air Force, there was a lot of, diversity. We came to work, we did things together, and we worked it out together, and then we went home. And we went home to our separate areas and spaces, and there wasn't a lot of friendships. And then I think in terms of how do we work in those areas where we're connected to, so my connection right now is the church. and that's, a huge institution of the church and the Episcopal Church, and looking at and realizing how much this country we're not technically a Christian church, but Christianity weaved its way into everything from the beginning, and we were flawed, deeply flawed from the beginning, with, just how we've taken and made what they call now, we were having some conversation the other day, white Christianity. It's like everywhere we went and took it with us and showed the indigenous peoples, it was all about the whiteness of Jesus. And, so, we're looking at our language in the Episcopal Church, just how our books of worship use, the references, and how we focus on darkness, and blackness is bad, and light and whiteness is good. And just that kind of language has such a profound effect on us, I think, as white people, as we continue to affirm the goodness of our color, and how it just oppresses the people people of color who are coming in and are like hearing this language. So language is huge. How can we tackle that piece of our language, and the messages that it gives? And I'll invite Laura.
Thank you, Frances. So I had two resources kind of bring this question right smack dab into my face. And in one group in the congregation, we watched the documentary 13th, which is all about incarceration and the laws that have been built around prison terms and 3 strikes and you're out, and all the different policies that have been put in place. And one of the things that struck me the most, and something that I know and I see, and it's there and I know it, but it just brought it to me in a not in a different way, but just making me aware again, just those reminders to be aware, was the media, and how the media treats and reports on white criminals and Black criminals, and all of the cops shows, or the Law and Order. We like to watch Law and Order all the time, but how are those images reinforced in all the different shows that are based on law enforcement, and that? And so that's one of the ways that I was thinking through that. And then I was also reading the book Caste by Isabel Wilkerson, and was really struck. She says there's 8 different things that create this system in our society, and one of them was dehumanization, and how we have built systems to dehumanize others, and the way we've used medicine in that, whether it be through experimentation and using people of color as subjects, whether we have used or forced medical care on people of color because We did not want procreation. We did not want them to reproduce. All of these different ways that we have dehumanized people of color and taken away their ability to own their own bodies, or even redefine their own bodies in what white people wanted them to be. And so those are things that came to mind, and those are the things that are in my mind right now from other resources that I've been looking at. And I think that's everyone, if I was keeping track right.
Yep, I think that's, we didn't miss anybody, right? Well, let's talk about the next question. What positive reinforcements did you need from your personal and other networks to be able to comfortably inhabit your racial identity, to identify ongoing racial discrimination, stigma, and prejudice, and to develop a more helpful range of racial coping strategies? What would have made a difference? And I think I'll look to James to kick us off.
Did John get to go with that last question? Okay.
I remember seeing a version of this question in the text as well, and it took a little while for me to start to get those imagination juices flowing, but I think I appreciated the opportunity to think back into my past and to say, now what could have been different? So I think and I grew up in a very monoculture community, but I wanted, as I think back, it would have been really neat to be as a family, like as a core family, a little bit more, or quite a lot more curious or interested in other foods, for example, to maybe come to know one of the migrant worker families in the area, even the seasonal workers, try to build some relationship with them, and maybe even share some cooking and eating time. I mean, that would have been pretty neat. My father grew up speaking a little bit of Norwegian, but by the time my generation came around, that had receded quite a little bit. So even just digging into other language that actually comes from my own heritage, I think that would have helped me to develop more curiosity about others, and about other ways of expressing ideas, for example. Yeah, so I think exposure to difference and more out of a spirit of adventure, that would have helped me, I think, have a better start. Mm-hmm. I'm going to invite Sheila Marie. Sheila, please.
Thanks, James. So this was an interesting one. When I look back, I think of, and as I walk through the questions of the book, just experiences that I hadn't really thought of and sometimes showed up that might give an example of this. We didn't talk about this. We would have family meal night 7 days a week, and it would be about all kinds of things, but never this. And if race came up, my stepfather was quite prejudiced, and so would shut the conversation down. So conversation would have helped, or in safe space with family would have helped, just to find language to kind of reference back to Francis and that kind of thing. I can remember being a teenager, and my a cousin of my mom's and her husband had 2 children and chose to adopt 2 Black children, one with special needs, and a boy and a girl. And I remember meeting them in my aunt and uncle's house, and it was just quiet. There wasn't really conversation around, I don't know what, and I look back at this now, and I don't honestly know why their choices specifically, and it was a perfect opportunity to just enter in a different way. What I remember about the little that was said was their effort to look for artwork and toys and things that would reflect the culture of the little ones as they were growing up. And that was as close as we got to it back in the day. And maybe just some openness and, as James said, some curiosity and the opportunity to poke into spaces that were different than the norm. And I laughed at myself because I was looking at notes and was a Star Trek fan way back in the day with the original series, where there were all kinds of ideas about how beings could look. And I can remember again with my my stepdad saying, "Isn't this amazing?" He's like, "Oh, none of that's going to make any difference, and just turn it off." And there was no exploration. I will say that what comes to mind as I look at those things is that I was particularly fortunate in later years to know people who were just filled with grace as I began to try on that curiosity that was living from younger years. And it's possible, I think, that my naivete that came forward with that was a blessing, because I was less scripted when I did have the opportunity to learn from friends later in life. And perhaps that curiosity just stayed alive because I really wanted to know something about that. So reinforcements would have been conversation and just a level of awareness and an openness to try on things that were things and ideas and possibilities different from the norm. So I guess that's what I would say. Karen?
Excellent. Thank you, Sheila. Yeah, I think Rufus used the word that I actually have written down here, acknowledgement. I grew up in a very home similar to yours, Sheila, that it wasn't talked about. My schools, it wasn't talked about. Church, it wasn't talked about. And it was kind of a void. When I look back on it, it's kind of odd because I really grew up in the 60s. So, I mean, when I think of what was going on in the 60s in terms of what was on the news and what was, just in politics and the race riots, and never once did we talk about it. And I think about it now and I think, isn't that amazing? I mean, at least I have no recollection that it was a safe spot for anybody to ever talk. And wouldn't that have been great? So acknowledgement and a discussion. And I'll pass it on to, do I see Dave down there? Dave Haven?
I said on my screen, I'm on the top. I'm not down there, so.
Okay. Okay, up there.
Okay. I thought of a couple things that whole integration with folks of other cultures, which I got a little bit of. We lived about 6 miles from an Indian reservation, and our big town in North Dakota that we would go to was Devil's Lake, North Dakota, which was on the Fort Totten Indian reservation, now called the Spirit Nation. So we would always, and our ski area was there too. So we had lots of opportunities to drive through the reservation, but rarely did we take any opportunity to stop and just integrate and talk with the people. But I do remember going with my aunt and uncle one day, and they just turned off the road and decided they were going to go visit some people on the reservation. And it was fascinating. We were welcomed into this, just knocked on the door and we were welcomed in and had a great conversation. And just that experience alone just gave me a window into a culture that I didn't have any awareness before. So more of that would have been helpful. I thought too that I had a aunt and uncle who were missionaries in Ecuador for several years, and then in Peru, and then in Mexico. And never once did anybody think of sending me or my brother and sister down in the summertime to spend a summer with them. Maybe to learn the language, to be immersed in the culture of another. And I'm thinking now, what a missed opportunity. So then I think of my own, bringing up our own children, and where did I miss opportunities with them too, introducing them to different cultures. So just that whole idea of integration. But the other thing about the range of history, I would have liked some positive reinforcement about the history more of Indigenous people, for instance, because that's who I was closest to in our farming area. We got kind of the textbook 1960s version of the movement westward, but we didn't get anything from the Indigenous people's perspective necessarily. So some history and some integration into culture. So, all right, John, how about you?
Thank you. I guess the positive reinforcements I've experienced, maybe the graciousness of colleagues, friends, parishioners who put up with my ignorance and gently taught me things that I didn't know. And I think 3 years ago, I was going to a meeting with our Methodist pastor in Leavenworth, who at that time was an African-American woman. And we met up at the, whatever the Y, big Y, whatever that is, park and ride out there towards Leavenworth, and went on from there and came back, and on the window of a car was a scrap of paper with the OK symbol sign drawn on it, and I said, "What's that?" And she explained that that's racist symbol, white supremacist use of that, and talking about, well, why would somebody put that on somebody's window? Is that, who are they trying to impress or intimidate with that? So I've been thinking about a wonderful former parishioner, as her 100th birthday is coming up in November, and I was writing a little memory for her scrapbook her family's put together, and recalling the first time that I met her was when we moved in to the parsonage of where we were going, and she wanted to make sure I knew how to pronounce her name. A Japanese American woman, name spelled Honda, and she says it's pronounced Honda, not Honda. A little thing, but important. How you how do you address people, and try to call them by correctly pronounced, not make fun of their names. And she would become somebody over the course of my 7 years there, somebody who would let me know, somebody who was sensitive and aware, and somebody who traveled between cultures in her career, and other things that to help me not insult people and not and know the little things that would make a difference in that pastorate. So some dear friends I've had that have helped me. Francis?
Thanks. So what would have been a positive influence that could have helped me? I guess early, if I look at took it as stages, I always lament that even though my dad was white, he spoke fluent Spanish, and I wish he had taught us all how to speak Spanish. He grew up in Cuba, and that's where he learned it. And but he just didn't really want to engage. It wasn't until I was well into my 30s that I caught him speaking Spanish with the restaurant guy. And it was like it was all coming back to him. And I just thought, man, because even though it would have, been within our household, it would have been something that was outside of the norm, to have this other language and to have to train my mind in that way. I find that something that amazes me, how this goes back to the other question of how what we see around us, how people get so angry of other people who are speaking other languages. And I think they're speaking another language. They speak English and Spanish, or English and French, or English and German, or English, and it's me that did not take on that challenge of learning another language and training my mind. So something like that in my household. I guess in school, to have been able to have proper conversation around race rather than structured, instead of me getting in arguments with kids, and teachers not even, not address, they weren't addressed. They didn't address. We just learned the same thing that everybody else learned, the melting pot of the United States. So really having the truth taught, rather than me getting my own stuff to read, which my mom encouraged that. So I did that. I exposed myself, but knowing that the institution of the school system had a investment, in exposing us to truth, instead of glossing over and delving into. Yes, you learned about the Trail of Tears, but we didn't really dwell on it. We didn't really learn what the Trail of Tears meant. So those kinds of things. I also was fortunate being the youngest of 5. And so as my older siblings were in school and their exposure, I might have been 8 and 9, but they were 18, 19, 20. And so, and my mom said, anybody you want to bring home, bring them home. And so I got exposed to other people through their exposure in college. And, but I do know that the odd exposure that I did have, I remember once having, we went on a picnic with some other friends of my parents, and I guess they were friends with some, African Americans. And so that was the one time I played with some kids that were not the kids that I grew up with in our white bubble community. But so, wishing that there would have been some way to have made some kind of push into other different folks' lives so that we weren't in the bubble we were in, because we were in a bubble. So our exposure was always through kind of reading about things as opposed to actual engaging and learning how to engage. So that would have been, I think, a more positive way to help me. And my brother's the only one who has his own kids, and so I think he's tried to take it a step further, and have his kids have engaged a step further from him. So he's become a multicultural family. So that's kind of Neat. I don't know, is Laura, you went or no? Okay.
Thank you, Francis. So I grew up with my dad being a police officer and getting a lot of mixed messages, lots of mixed messages. So I think the thing that would have helped me the most was that understanding that the author talks about in the book, about knowing that there are biases already existing when you're born, and to understand that your parents have that, your teachers have that, all, you know, all of those authority figures that you look up to as a child have those things. And so these mixed messages that I would get, it would help explain those. I remember not knowing what the N word was. And I'm not going to say it. I'm guessing that everybody knows what that is. And asking as an innocent kid what it was and getting punished. And so having this understanding of, okay, what's going on in people's minds and thinking, and what messages were they raised with? What messages have they been socialized with? And that would have helped me a lot as a child. I think the other side of it, and a couple of people have talked about this, is that the education system is knowing that those biases existed in the resources. I mean, I remember going to college and being so naive in this topic that taking an intro to anthropology class and realizing that race was a social concept and not something that was based on physical characteristics. I remember being shocked. And I was in my 20s. And I also remember being very mad that here I had been taught in all these different ways that that race existed and it was built on physical characteristics when it was really a social concept. So having an education system that helped me see that truth that others have talked about, that helped me critically examine the resources and the understanding that everybody that I saw as an authority figure had their own biases and their own ways of looking at the world. That would have helped a lot. Rufus?
Thanks, Laura. So one thing I will do is a shout out my parents. I had the opportunity of growing up to travel a lot with my parents and then travel on my own. And you know, that was something that I really appreciated, being exposed to being in a place like India and being in a minority. And I think that's something that was super helpful. I think what would have been more helpful, or also would have been helpful, is you know, an understanding that history is written by the victors, right? And that you know, that it's you know, the heroic notion of westward expansion, while it wasn't great, but look at the impact, right? And I think just the understanding and the acknowledgement of look at the impact and how that happened and what the consequences were, and it was more than a heroic story. It doesn't diminish the good things, but it's the flip side of the coin. And so I think that would have been, to my mind, really helpful. And I think I would also even though we didn't live in a very diverse community at that time, just conversations about what it's like. Again, acknowledging the reality of different experiences and you know, sort of attuning myself towards the you know, being able to see the world through something beyond my own experience, and at least being curious and open. I think we've all spoken to that curiosity and openness to You know, and that mindset, I think, is huge in education and in our family, in our home life, and in our own personal journeys. So that's what would have, I think, helped me advance my thinking further. Obviously, this isn't about a revisionist history. It's not like, oh, I wish I would have, but you know, trying to think forward. What would help us as we contemplate these same issues today, right? And so the final question, the third question we have, but maybe I will ask Laura to kick off because she's gone pretty much the last couple of times, is, you know, what are ways that you think about that you could shift the socialization, the racial socialization messages you received and show up differently, you know, in the here and now in the Wenatchee Valley in 2020. Laura?
Thank you, Rufus. One of the things that came to mind almost immediately when I read this is those jokes that we all hear, the jokes that just kind of push along that line, that ride that line of might not being okay, but being okay, and people kind of pushing the envelope with those jokes and ending the silence around that and calling them out and actually saying, you know what, can we talk about that and think about what that means when you say that. So that's one of them. The other one has been something that I've actively done with my children and continue to do is we travel a lot. We don't, I think we, as a family, maybe we've gone on 1 or 2 airplane trips, but we do road trips and we've gone all over this country and talked about the observations that we've seen and the people that we've seen and the diversity and just the different cultures and such, and engaging the different ways this people show up in our country, and continuing those conversations at our dinner table and talking and not doing the silence is golden kind of parenting that I grew up with. And then the last thing would be lifting up awareness for those things that I've observed. About a month ago, I took my oldest daughter over to Seattle to drop her off at the airport, and I was coming back on I-5 and had my 14-year-old in the car with me, and we were headed north on I-5, and on I-5 going south, we all of a sudden saw all these police line up to block traffic and get out of their cars with guns and such. And we were trying to figure out what was going on because there wasn't any traffic coming from that way, but they were set up as if something was coming. And all we could think of was very violent people, or, you know, something was happening with very violent people. And it ended up being Black Lives Matter protesters that they were confronting. And that just kind of brought it home to me in a different way of how to me, how unrealistic a response that was to people who were trying to fight for their lives and weren't doing it in a violent way, but being met with violence. And so lifting those things up and making those observations to help people be curious around that. Those are the 3 ways that I think I identified. Francis?
Oh gosh. I think I don't know. I'm not sure I'm going to get 3 ways. but to continue to try to not only expand my own way of speaking, but how can I relate that back into the community that I serve in the church? How can I bring that understanding, which is not, it's tough. It's tough to break the church, break into the church, and to get the church to move. And then it's even tougher, on the smaller level. And it's not even this particular church. I think any church, any kind of congregation I would be in, because our language is so, it's so English, in the Episcopal Church, Anglican Church. And so how to rethink myself, the words that I'm saying, and to be as conscious of them myself, and to be able to honestly understand what I'm saying. It's so easy in the way we do things to say the words, because it's very repetitive, and we just kind of get into this great groove with it. And it's almost like a meditation at times. But then that means, am I really attuned to what it's saying? And how can I help the folks in our church also realize that it's beautiful, we love it, and what is it saying to other people who might be hearing it, and how that then might carry out with us into the larger community. How, if we're thinking about the language we're using, then how will that help us think about what we're saying when we're out in the larger community, in our neighborhoods and in our stores and in our other places of work. So that's where that's kind of where I'm moving right now. And I'll grant that I spent 3 days on liturgy and music getting ready for our general convention in 2 years, having these kinds of conversations. So, I'll admit that that's kind of made me go, oh yeah, I need to think about this stuff. I will invite Dave.
Thank you, Frances. This may seem like more of a stream of consciousness as I go through this. So I don't know if it's 2, 3, or 4, or 5 things that I think about. But a few years ago, one of our community leaders, Norma Gallegos, who many of you know, we were putting together an opportunity for people in our congregation to get to know some of the Latino folks in our community. This was following a naturalization class that had occurred at our church. But we wanted to continue those relationships that had developed. And Norma had a great idea where we would have members of our congregation and members who had just completed the naturalization courses to come together for a meal, but also to be seated at tables that were integrated more or less. And even we tried to get somebody who could speak both English and Spanish at each table. That wasn't always possible, but the 2 things that we did this 2 months in a row. And one of them was we had a map of the United States and a map of Mexico. And we would talk about where we were from, and had an opportunity to find out, I'm from North Dakota and this part, and we'd point on the map and we'd talk about that area. People would talk about Guadalajara, or whatever, and talk about that area. And it was just a way to personalize where people were from. And that was really important. The other thing was our names. And this kind of gets back to you, John, when you're talking about the importance of names. And I thought of that little household that I visited on the reservation that my aunt and uncle took me to. I still remember their name. Their last name was Little Ghost. And I don't know, it just popped into I remember that name. And thinking that I always thought that the Indian names were so funny until I started looking at the Norwegian names that I grew up with. And James, you may attest to this because your name means something. I think something like farm, gourd, something like that. Right?
Eel farm, eel farm.
Yeah. So, and my name was Haven, which basically meant harbor. If you think of Copenhagen means harbor. And so just names were important. So I think just little things like that can help in this socialization. Finding a friend, being intentional about just finding one person of color or different culture and trying to nurture that relationship would be helpful. To just not try to do the big things all the time, but to start with the little things. But as Laura mentioned too, just taking time to look at those opportunities within our community to be in solidarity with groups that are trying to make their voice heard, and to be affirming to those groups, even though it might be harmful to us as individuals, especially in a leadership role as pastors. We do need to be out there. The other thing, just one more thing on language. In our Lutheran tradition, we're very prone, especially Midwest Lutherans, to have a lingo. We talk about lutefisk and lefse, and we talk about all this kind of stuff. And there's all these jokes about red jello and church basements, and that doesn't resonate at all to people who are Lutheran in Florida, or the African Americans they don't know what we're talking about, and it's in-house lingo. And so sometimes even getting outside of that lingo can be helpful. So there we go. So I can't remember who hasn't gone yet. Karen and John. Karen, how about you?
Of course I have to go after red jello. Oh my goodness. Yes, heavens. And lutefisk and lefse is my life. Yeah. To add to it, many of what I have written down have already been spoken about. So I'll kind of hopefully put my personal spin on it. But to me, it's when I went through the Racial Healing Handbook and we came to this, what are those next steps? How do you, for our community? It made me realize that I grew up in an era of no communication. So just starting the communication was a huge issue. To figure out how to be comfortably uncomfortable, I think is that issue for the community as a whole, to be able to speak to each other. So for me, it's we're talking about that support, to actually go out and seek out, to go to the multicultural days, to spend more time with the people that I know at Pinnacles Prep, and to get to know their lives and to get to know it. That instead of, I think Laura mentioned talking about dehumanization of people, to actually be actively involved in humanization for both parts, both ways. I'm reading the Cast book also. Wow, it's really impactful for me. One of the things that they talked about was one of the reasons for not having interracial marriage. There were many, of course, but one of them was to not, if you marry, then people have relatives and you have empathy toward, you have empathy towards your niece or your nephew that is of a different color than you are. You start to humanize people. And so that was one of the reasons, given to making sure interracial marriages were illegal, was that kind of fraternizing with the enemy. So in terms of that humanization, to actually get out and to be with people, to make more opportunities perhaps in our community to do that, to maybe invite them to a little lutefisk and lefse, as long as they bring tamales, because those are much better tasting. And so, I guess that's it. And my second one, I think, is probably the most important one to me. And that's the extension of grace. I don't know about you guys, but I feel like I've just been stumbling all over myself the past couple of months. I feel like sometimes I feel like I don't get anything right. Feel like I'm kind of like on the wrong track, and in terms of addressing this issue or even talking about it, and I really appreciate those people, those friends, those new acquaintances that I have met through this journey that have extended me grace and helped to educate me and to teach me on that. And I hope that I can then extend grace also along the pathway, that kind of meeting people where they're at in the continuum, which was fantastic to go through in this handbook, that continuum, because we're all on that continuum of learning and sliding back and going forward and sliding back and going forward. So those were the two things that were important to me: discussion and extending of grace to everyone. And James, have you gone? We'll go for some more lutefisk and lefse from James.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, I think this touches on just, I've been really wanting to be more attuned and aware. And last session, we talked about Resma Menachem. And so I did go ahead and pick up the book that he wrote, My Grandmother's Hands. Appreciate that. He speaks about how we embody racialized trauma, and that the goal is to actually metabolize our trauma. And that's just wild language, but I think that it's kind of striking a chord for me. And so what that means for me is, in terms of something that I can try to do in terms of shifting, is he uses the term clean pain. And I think that has to do with, for me at least, a sense of authenticity or integrity, and humility as well when I'm in my circles around me, and when I'm met up with difference around me, to be really just simply open and more vulnerable to, like Karen says, where I do screw up, and to know that perhaps if I just kind of placed myself into the care of my neighbor, not having figured it all out, that they will probably receive me better than I think they will, right? So I can, in a way, let some of my own guard down. So I think I wrote down a few bullet points. So rather than trying to help people fit in, to actually spend time asking myself what I'm asking them to fit into, because I don't think that the goal is to whiteify our darker skinned neighbors. And I think that's, to me, that's a really big deal. And so a second bullet point to that would be to be open to hearing about another way to accomplish a similar goal, and to realize that there are gifts and skills and talents that come from other cultures that that could reveal a bit of a lacking in my culture, or in white thinking, I guess we could say as well. Yeah, so to learn from the gifts and the strengths of others, and to really look at a way of highlighting those as being special and unique and really treasures. So for me to try to move way past tolerance and more into a sense of of receiving and celebrating the gifts of the other. And then the last bullet point is to just simply ask permission. To ask permission whether I want to use a story that I just heard, or whether I want to sing a song that I just learned. To know that those are special things to the other. And I think part of white culture is to just grab it when you see it and not really worry about what or who you're grabbing it from. So to me, that's a little bit of a kind of a self-searching goal. So John, I think you, right?
If you insist. Should I ask for your red Jell-O though? I don't want to just take it. I guess I'm thinking of the words power and authority. Laura talked about images of police officers, police enforcement, law and order and all that. And I can honestly say I've never had an experience with a police officer that was not positive in my life. But I've also lived in Africa where I know that that's not the experience of many, if not most people. That if you're in trouble, you don't go to the police to solve that problem. You find out other ways of doing that. And I know this country has had those different ways of doing that, from the Italians forming, it's the mafia that'll take care of whatever problem there is in the community. You don't go to the Irish police in Chicago. But that's, so I'm wondering though about myself. And I think, probably most police I've interacted with may not even recognize what authority, what power they have over people just by having a uniform on. What fear they might strike into other people because they know themselves probably to be nice, reasonable, whatever people who are trying to help their community. And so I wonder about myself as a white male pastor who's been to seminary, educated, whatever, supposedly speaks for God now and then anyway, and do I abuse that authority or wield it without even knowing that I am at different times? And so try to be sensitive to that. And yet on the other hand, there are times I think there are probably people who want me to say, well, what would God say about this situation, or where is God in this situation, and claim that authority too, rather than leave that word of God to people who are not people I would recommend. That's not the God I know. So anyway, so those are the things I'm thinking on right now. Sheila, I don't think you've gone on this question yet.
Thanks, John. I will say that most of what I thought about has come up already in conversation. The things that really stick for me are this idea of awareness, and awareness built in a safe space like this is a great thing. But if it's not something that goes out from here, then it's still more for my benefit than for anyone else. And so I think of how that looks for me, and humility has come up a couple of times, to be willing to fail, to learn, to immerse myself, to support, to, instead of right or wrong, I'm just show up and be present to what's happening and be willing to learn and ask questions. And I lead a group sort of along these lines right now at as part of the church as a study group. And there was a young woman who joined us a couple of weeks ago that's in her 20s. And she said something that sticks with me that I think fits in this space, that says, just an awareness of walking into a room and being aware of how much space I take up by virtue of the skin I was born into and that kind of thing. And just being aware of how much space I take up, how I speak, how I present, and how I enter in, such that I will also then be aware of everyone around me that makes that so. And those are the things that, you know, a collection of oddities that I think fit inside many of the other things that have already been discussed. So those are the things that I'm thinking of. Rufus?
Thank you, Sheila. So like you said, much of what I thought about has been expressed. I've really, this sort of sense of grace that Karen talked about, and the meeting people where they are is an essential, that really resonates with me. The other piece that I think for me that I can continue to grow at is finding constructive ways to respond to people when they say things that need to be challenged. I mean, I think we can talk about race in ways and otherness in ways that divide people, but I think I can think of a couple of examples in my own recent experience when I've had people who've said, you know, I believe in people's right to protest, but I draw the line at dropping to a knee with the national anthem. Well, to me, that's hypocritical, and I should have called it out, because, you know, you can't. I mean, if it's okay if you're in favor of peaceful protests, and that's a peaceful protest, how dare any of us say you can't? You have to protest the way that it makes it comfortable for me, right? And so I think that was one example that I think I needed to call that out in some hopefully constructive way. And I've seen that also with Black Lives Matter. 94% of the protests have been nonviolent, yet all of the heat and light has been around. All the heat has been around the few protests where there have been violence, and who knows who was at the bottom of those protests. And letting that message of, hey, we count as a people, and our lives don't matter in this society like the dominant culture, that's been subsumed by, you know, this is about violence. Well, no, it's not. And so, at any rate, so I think I can do a better job as a human being of standing up and stepping up, hopefully in a constructive way, but also in a way that's meaningful when I see these things happening more than I have in the past, because I think I've not done it, and I've kind of stepped back at times when I needed to step up. So that's what I'm thinking about. I think we're hitting an hour and a half mark here, folks, and so I have to be respectful of people's time. I think I will open this up for kind of closing thoughts. Anything else people want to say, reflect on, amplify before we sign off for this session 3 of Living into Inclusivity? Go ahead and unmute. Who's got any thoughts?
Well, I'd just like to say thank you. This workbook, and I'll hold it up so readers can see it, listeners who are listening to this broadcast. This has been very good. I was a little intimidated at first to really go through it. I found myself writing in it, but I found it to be very well written and very personal. It really helped me do how do I want to put it? The world's not linear, that you can go backwards and forwards, and where am I at? And in terms of acceptance and whatnot. It was very good for me personally. I recommend it. So thank you. I believe it was Laura who recommended it. Thank you very much.
I think to that point, the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross book on death and dying and the stages of grief. I think if people are aware of that book and those stages that go in and out, it's not linear. That's helpful to think about that in terms of this book as well, that it's not linear, but that different times we're at different places. So just a comment on that.
Very much.
Other thoughts?
And I really appreciate everyone's comments. Wow, you guys are amazing. I've written, taking notes. It's lots to think about. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
One other thing, and I don't mean, about names, but I mean, how many twigs are there in the woods?
Great question.
Okay.
It's all relative.
Right,
Thank
and
you,
then I'll just
Dave.
add in that Marie really is my last name, okay?
Yeah, thank you, yeah. I like Tina Marie, yes. All right, everyone. Well, thank you for a rich and I'd really appreciate this group and you individually and this opportunity to kind of collectively, openly, kind of do this work. And I really I think it's helpful for me and I think I'm very blessed.
And thank you for stepping up to
Thank you.
facilitate this time, Rufus.
Yeah, thanks, Rufus.
And did we schedule a next time?
Let me finish this conversation. I'll stop